On Monday the 5th of May 1997, 8-year-old Jamie Lavis left his home in Greater Manchester in England to play with his friends. He was caught on CCTV that morning at a nearby bus station, but then Jamie vanished and he would never be seen alive again. The community rallied around the family, and one man, a bus driver called Darren Vickers, quickly came forward to say that he was the last person to see Jamie before he disappeared. Vickers put himself right in the middle of the investigation, including leading repeated searches for Jamie and making multiple TV and radio appearances. But far more insidious than that was him ingratiating himself into the Lavis family home, including eventually moving in. This picture shows Vickers sat between Jamie's parents, Karen and John, with them being unaware at this point they were sitting with a man who was responsible for Jamie's disappearance and his murder. The evil of Darren Vickers, a murderer who manipulated his victim's family, is truly disturbing. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Jamie Aaron Lavis was born on the 16th of March 1989 in Manchester, a city in northwest England. He was the son of Karen Spooner and John Lavis. Jamie was described as a, quote, energetic scamp, a mischievous and cheeky little boy who always had a smile on his face and who adored his parents and his siblings. At the time of his abduction and his death, he just turned 8 years old. Karen later said that her son looked very small for his age. He stood at just 4 foot tall and wore clothes which would fit a 5 or 6 year old. However, Jamie wouldn't let this stand in his way and would make up for his small frame with his personality and his infectious smile. Jamie would often go out and spend time with his friends and his siblings in the local area, leaving the house in the morning but always coming back before sunset as he was afraid of the dark. Jamie had no school on Monday the 5th of May 1997 as it was a bank holiday, and so he left his home in the morning to go and play with his friends and walk around the area. By 5 p.m, his family were getting worried, and as darkness closed in, they became frantic. They scoured the streets looking for Jamie, but there was no trace of him. They then called Greater Manchester Police, who immediately began a search, with them being joined by hundreds of local residents. The police decided to call a press conference around 48 hours after Jamie had gone missing, and this led to a number of phone calls and leads, including people who approached the family directly. One of these was Darren Vickers, a 28-year-old married father of 2 from Manchester, who actually lived just 100 yards from the Lavis family home, although he didn't know them. He approached Jamie's sister and said, quote, he wouldn't happen to be wearing a dark blue Reebok tracksuit, would he? The brand of clothing Jamie had been wearing had not been released to the press, and so instantly Vickers became a person of interest, but initially just as a witness, as he'd clearly seen the missing boy. Vickers was a bus driver, and he told the police that Jamie had been at the bus stop on the morning of his disappearance. Vickers said that Jamie had boarded his bus, the number 219, and had spent around the next 5 hours travelling backwards and forwards along the route from Ashton-under-Lyne bus interchange, where he'd first seen Jamie, into central Manchester. It was not uncommon for Jamie to ride around on the bus all day. He was fascinated by them and enjoyed looking out of the window, waving at people on the street. Vickers said that Jamie was just another passenger, and aside from checking on him a few times in between runs, they had minimal interaction. He said that at the end of the shift, at around 5 p.m, he'd given Jamie a lift in his car because it was raining, dropping him close to his home, and he was last seen walking in that direction. Vickers then said that he went back to his own house, where he spent the rest of the night. Several members of his family confirmed his alibi. This narrowed down the police's inquiries, and they began following up on Vickers' statements. Jamie's parents, Karen and John, were extremely grateful to Vickers. He'd given them some hope, some tangible sighting of their son, and he soon became firm friends with the pair. Vickers took it upon himself to coordinate search parties in the local area, and he would put up missing posters in the windows of local shops. As the days progressed, Vickers would spend more and more time in the family home. Karen later stated, quote, he was like a best friend. Anything that we wanted doing, he'd be there, offering his help, no matter what it was, not the time of day or night, he would be there. The police quickly became suspicious. Every time officers tried to update the family, Vickers was there. It got to the point where officers were asked to contact him with any updates. When the police were not there, Darren Vickers was doing his best to undermine their investigation, calling the detectives useless, lazy, etc., and Karen and John became more and more dependent on Vickers. He purchased a police scanner and essentially set up his own command centre in the family home. Any mention of sizes of young boys he heard, he would drive Jamie's distraught parents to the location. On at least one occasion, detectives turned up to follow a lead, to find Vickers, with Karen and John in tow, already there. Vickers would also do the same thing if a member of the public knocked on the door with information. He would drag Karen and John around the Manchester area at all hours of the day. Vickers set himself up as the only person who really cared about the welfare of Jamie, and he became the family's spokesman, including being interviewed by the news, as shown by this clip.
It's like any child that has a day saver ticket which you're boarded with. It's up to them what they do with it. They paid for the ticket, they can do really what they please with it.
All of this happened within a matter of weeks, and the speed with which Vickers wormed his way into the Lavis family home concerned police. He was there most of the day and night, and his attention bordered on the obsessive. Detectives began looking into Darren Vickers and his story. What they found rang alarm bells, and also showed that Vickers was lying. CCTV footage had been recovered which showed Jamie at the bus station on the morning of the day he disappeared. Police expected to find this, however, they didn't expect to find footage of Darren Vickers following Jamie, approaching him, talking to him, ruffling his hair, and then leading him towards his bus. This contradicted Vickers' earlier statement that he'd been driving the bus and Jamie had simply gotten on. Also, officers had interviewed passengers on the number 219 bus, and they had confirmed, as Vickers had said, that Jamie had spent hours going backwards and forwards along the route. But rather than being just another passenger, Jamie had been sitting with Vickers in the cab and even taking the controls. One passenger described the bus shaking and swaying and briefly mounting the curb after Vickers allowed Jamie to play with the gear stick. Jamie was also playing with the buttons on the ticket machine and even handing out change. The passengers believed that Jamie was Vickers' son, given how close they seemed to be. One woman said that she asked, quote, "Are you having a day out with your dad?" To which Jamie looked at Vickers, then turned back to the woman and said, "No, with my uncle." They also found that Vickers was a practiced liar. He'd fabricated his employment history in order to get his job as a bus driver, and this included presenting a reference from someone who he'd apparently worked for, but the police later found out this person was in fact a convicted paedophile. It does appear that Darren Vickers had a criminal record, but it's not clear what this was for. It should be pointed out that several articles I've read seem to indicate that Vickers was a convicted paedophile. This doesn't seem to be correct. It appears that, as I said, he had a reference from someone who was a child sex offender, as opposed to Vickers having this type of history. I may be wrong, but information I've read from the court proceedings and the police investigation itself don't mention this. I do find it interesting, however, that Vickers was associating with a known paedophile. I think that he was likely friends with this person because they both shared a sick fascination with little boys. Based on their inquiries, Darren Vickers was arrested on suspicion of the abduction of Jamie Lavis on May the 24th, 1997, around 3 weeks after his disappearance. His hold over Karen and John by this point can be seen by the fact they camped outside the police station, apparently as a protest against the arrest of an innocent man. Karen even told the media that the police were merely scapegoating Vickers because they'd failed to do their job and they were just trying to appear productive. The police were convinced that Darren Vickers was guilty of abducting Jamie and likely murdering him, but they had no evidence, and so they had to release him. On the day he was released, officers were dismayed to hear loud cheers outside from members of the Lavis family and their supporters, essentially giving Vickers, the man the police believed murdered Jamie, a hero's welcome back into the fold. From this point, Vickers' hold over the Lavis family intensified. His media appearances became more and more frequent. He appeared in the family home on camera, denying that he had anything to do with the disappearance of Jamie, and also called radio shows, volunteering information and talking about himself as a member of the family. I'll now play clips from these TV and radio appearances.
If I would have never come forward in the first place, just to let them know that I'd seen Jamie on that day, they'd never been nothing the wiser today. They'd have been ripping their head, pulling at straws, you know. You know, I thought I did the right decent thing in letting them know that I'd seen him on the day, but I'd never thought I'd have been, you know, arrested on suspicion of his abduction. I think it's just a joke. That I've got nothing to do with the abduction of James Lavis, and I've got the backing of the Lavis family.
Darren, you're the bus driver that was the last person to see little Jamie alive. How come he hasn't been seen since?
I'll never know till the day he comes home. I still believe he's alive. If the case was what the police are making out to be, if the case was he was dead, around where they're looking, they'd have found him by now.
So how's the police investigation going?
The police are not letting much information out about that. Which the family is supposed to know, the first confirmed sightseeing. Yeah. We've never been told.
Vickers then moved into the family home, and whilst Karen and John slept downstairs, he took their bed. This, in their mind, was the least they could do for someone who was spending every hour of the day looking for their son. He would also pose with Karen and John for pictures for the newspaper, including this bizarre photo, which we'll come back to later. Police were becoming increasingly concerned about Vicas' behaviour. His involvement with the Lavis family was obsessive, and they found out that he'd lost his job and was even neglecting his own wife and children, ignoring phone calls from them and spending weeks away without ever seeing them. Officers tried to speak to Karen and John, but they, especially Karen, would dismiss their concerns. Arresting Vickers and releasing him allowed him to claim that he was entirely innocent and the police were incompetent, when the reality was they knew he was guilty, but just didn't have the evidence, yet. This pantomime went on for 5 months, but Vickers' luck would eventually run out, and he would be shown for the monster he was. However, he wasn't done tormenting Jamie's parents, and his behaviour in court is nothing short of sickening. In October 1997, 5 months after Jamie Lavis' disappearance, police were still investigating the case, and the dominoes quickly began to fall. Police checked Darren Vickers' alibi and found that his family had lied about him being at home all night on the day that Jamie had disappeared. He'd been seen driving long after he claimed to be indoors with his wife and children. This was all the police needed, and on October 14, 1997, Vickers was arrested on suspicion of abducting Jamie Lavis. Members of his family were also arrested for perverting the course of justice. He continued to deny everything, but the Crown Prosecution Service felt there was enough evidence to charge him with this crime, and he was remanded into custody. However, the police knew he'd killed Jamie, and although they didn't have the evidence, this would soon change. The arrest of Vickers was in the paper, and several teenagers called the police and told them about having been approached by the man they'd seen on television who had given them alcohol and cigarettes before luring them into some isolated woods in Reddish Vale, around 6 miles away from where Jamie had last been seen alive and near the town of Stockport. They had run away, but it's clear Vickers' intention was sexual. Police began searching the area, and on October the 23rd, officers found a child's jacket and tracksuit bottoms laid out on the ground. Police picked them up, and the lower jawbone of a child fell out of the clothing. This was tested and found to match the dental records of Jamie Lavis. Subsequently, bones from a child's torso were found nearby, but this was all that was left of Jamie. His skull was never found. Some news reports erroneously seem to indicate that Jamie was dismembered. This doesn't appear to be the case. After being killed at the spot where he was found, he was left in the open and the animals had scattered his remains. With this discovery, Darren Vickers was charged with the murder of Jamie Lavis. The police had the heartbreaking task of sitting Jamie's parents down and telling them that not only was their son dead, but the man they'd taken into their home, who they trusted and believed was helping them, was his killer. Both Karen and John accepted what they were being told and apologised to the police for how they'd acted before. And so, Darren Vickers was exposed for the evil predator that he is. He's a man so sick and twisted that he spent 5 months essentially tormenting the family of a child he murdered, going out on search parties and telling Karen and John that their son was still alive when he knew all along where he was and that he was dead. Unfortunately, this was not the end of Darren Vickers' horrific treatment of Jamie's parents, and things would only get worse before he faced justice. Darren Vickers pleaded not guilty to the abduction and murder of Jamie Lavis. His trial began at Manchester Crown Court in March 1999, almost 2 years after the crime. Vickers, the disgusting monster that he is, entirely turned on Karen and John and was determined to throw them under the bus. He said that John had killed his own son for reasons he never explained, and he went on to state that he and Karen had begun an affair a few months after he moved in. Karen had become pregnant during the time he lived with the family, and he claimed on the stand that the child was his. This was publicised and the rumour mill went into overdrive. Karen was forced to get a DNA test to prove that Vickers wasn't the father. He also told the jury, referring to Karen and the family as a whole, quote, "I'm telling you, she did not seem bothered at all. The way they were going around, you would never have thought they had a child missing." This had nothing to do with proving his guilt or innocence. He just wanted to cause as much distress as possible to the family of a murdered child. Whilst in prison awaiting his trial, Vickers had apparently written a 15-page confession letter. It appears he must have given this to someone in the prison, as the content is known, but he apparently retracted this confession. However, when you hear what he wrote, you'll be able to tell it's complete bollocks. He wrote, quote, "I'm not sure where it went wrong. Jamie was starting to mess with the ticket machine. I told him, 'Don't, you'll jam it.' I raised my left hand and hit him on the side of the head. I looked round and braked hard. Jamie, when I hit him, fell back, hitting his head on the luggage rack. His eyes were closed. I started to panic bad. Christ, I've killed him. I did not mean for anything like this to happen." Vickers also wrote he then took Jamie's body, put it in his own vehicle, and then dumped it in Reddish Vale. Clearly Darren Vickers was considering his next move. He'd written a confession claiming that Jamie's death was accidental, and therefore he was guilty only of manslaughter. I think he weighed up his options. Pleading guilty to manslaughter would mean prison time, but far less than murder, but he didn't want to spend any more time behind bars, and arrogantly, I think he thought he could beat the charge, and so he went back to denying everything. However, it seems that Vickers had been bragging in prison, and a prisoner he shared a cell with testified in court that Vickers had in fact admitted murdering Jamie. Darren Vickers was caught in his own web of lies. He couldn't keep his story straight, and this, along with the fact he was the last person seen with Jamie and had tried to lure other boys to a place where his body was found, sealed his fate. On April the 23rd, 1999, Darren Vickers was convicted of the abduction and murder of 8-year-old Jamie Lavis, with the case clearly showing that his crimes were sexually motivated. Vickers then stood before Mr. Justice Forbes for sentencing. He stated, quote, "Jamie's brief life was cruelly and prematurely brought to an end because he had the tragic misfortune of boarding your bus." He added, "Thereafter, you carefully groomed this little boy so he stayed on your bus for the rest of the day. You did this for your own base motives and intended to, and did, sexually abuse this little boy and then killed him and abandoned his body in Reddish Vale. You unclothed his body and left it naked on the ground." The judge concluded by saying, "These are truly wicked crimes." He then sentenced him. For the abduction and murder of Jamie Lavis, Darren Vickers was sentenced to life imprisonment. The day after his conviction, Vickers asked to see the lead detective in the case. It was to him that he apparently confessed his guilt. The details of what he said were not specifically shared with the public, but were with the sentencing judge and Jamie's family. What is known is that Vickers confessed to luring Jamie into his car sometime in the afternoon of Monday the 5th of May 1997 after his shift on the bus. He then drove him to Reddish Vale, sexually assaulted him and killed him, likely by strangulation. Vickers then left Jamie's body naked on the open ground. As we'll see, this confession had nothing to do with feelings of guilt. It was about getting a lighter sentence, as the judge was still considering a minimum tariff. This was eventually set at 25 years. The judge indicated that he gave some small amount of credit for Vickers' confession, but this was minimal, given how serious his crimes were. Darren Vickers, ever the manipulator, retracted all of his confessions after his imprisonment, and appealed his conviction in 2003 and 2005. Both times, this was refused. Apparently in around 2013, he had taken full responsibility for his crimes. No doubt, this was him playing an angle like he always did. After serving 25 years, in February 2023, Vickers went before the parole board, who denied any application for release or a move to a less secure prison. Thankfully, Darren Vickers, now aged 57, remains in prison to this day, 27 years after the murder. He will likely be eligible to apply for parole again in 2025. Let us pray the parole board does not believe his lies, because, as one detective said, quote, "Darren Vickers should never be released. He will be a danger to children." In the next section, we'll conclude by looking at just how evil Darren Vickers truly is, as well as outlining the possibility that he was responsible for other crimes within the Lavis household, which potentially resulted in a young man taking his own life years later. As I've said in previous videos, people who offend against children are often drawn to the power disparity. Abusing a child makes them feel powerful because they're able to physically dominate their victim, but also easily manipulate them into doing whatever they want. This they find sexually arousing, hence why they continue to abuse the young. This need for power and to dominate sits at the core of who Darren Vickers is. He enjoys manipulating and grooming people in order to place himself in ultimate control of a situation. This didn't just include children, but also adults. He loves exploiting weakness and vulnerability. He's a true predator. When he saw Jamie Lavis, he saw a target. Given that he lived a short distance from the Lavis family home, and Jamie was often at the bus station, he likely saw him repeatedly over his short life, and had likely been fantasizing about harming this little boy. On Monday the 5th of May 1997, he saw Jamie and decided to make his fantasies a reality. I think he likely decided to kill him very early on, and him allowing Jamie to sit in his lap, change gear, etc. was also to ensure that later Jamie would agree to go with his quote-unquote uncle to the place where his life would end. Whilst Jamie was playing on the bus, Vickers was likely sitting there having fantasies about what he was going to do to him later on. The fact that Vickers allowed this grooming process to take place right in front of everyone shows another key trait of his: narcissism. Specifically, his belief in his own intellectual superiority. He thought he could act in any way that he wanted, and then he would easily be able to talk himself out of any situation. These two traits are integral to understanding what happened next. After killing Jamie, Vickers injected himself into the police investigation. This isn't unusual. Many killers do this, including Ian Huntley, the Soham murderer, and Stuart Hazel, the killer of Tia Sharps in Name Just 2. Their primary motivation is often to present themselves as a concerned citizen, with them believing that the police will think, well look, he's part of the search party, can't be him. It also enables them to remain close to the investigation, so they can try and steer inquiries away from themselves, and potentially destroy evidence or cover up mistakes if the authorities get too close. This also applies to Darren Vickers, but this was not the main reason why he ingratiated himself into the Lavis family home. He did it because he saw an opportunity. He saw two vulnerable and desperate people who he could manipulate and control to get his sick kicks. Vickers gave Karen and John false hope that their son was still alive, not to comfort them, quite the opposite, to torment them. He would have inevitably loved seeing the flicker of hope in their eyes when he told them about a possible sighting he'd heard on his police scanner, or when a neighbour gave them some information. He would then drive them to the location, knowing there was nothing at the end of the journey, and that was the point. He wanted to see the disappointment in Jamie's parents' faces, their crushed hopes, each and every time. I don't believe that Vickers was particularly bothered by the police investigation. Yes, they'd arrested him, but they'd released him, and it was clear they didn't have any evidence against him. He was far too smart for them. I've no doubt he believed that if the police ever did catch up with him, he was so intellectually superior they could talk his way out of that situation. Vickers also neglected his own family and lost his job. This is because he was a man driven by controlling and manipulating others, and he had two people in the palm of his hand. He was having too much fun, so why would he bother doing anything else? Work and interacting with his own family took time out of his day to torment Karen and John. By moving in, he could control them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Which brings me to the picture of Darren Vickers sitting in the middle of the parents of the child he murdered. Forensic psychologist Kerry Danes described this as the quote, Most bizarre image I think I've ever seen. She added, "Where Jamie should be, right in the middle of the picture, is Darren Vickers, and he's spread-eagled. He's got a very dominant body posture, and he's got two arms wrapped, possessively, around Jamie's parents, who look shell-shocked, traumatised, and just bewildered by the position they find themselves in." Body language expert Cliff Lansley also stated, quote, "Here we have a viper in the nest. The perpetrator has implanted himself in the family and had the nerve to have his picture taken with them, without a top as well. How bizarre is this?" It is a truly strange image, but it makes sense when you think about it. You have a man who has his arms draped around his property, things he controls, who he believes are solely there for his entertainment. Him having his top off is some sort of caveman-esque sign of dominance in the household. And this is how Darren Vickers sees people in the world, simply as things. Jamie Lavis was just a thing to abuse to get his sexual kicks. Karen and John were not grieving parents, they were playthings. His own family were discarded because he had new toys to play with. I imagine he was a monster around his own family, manipulating and abusing them for his own amusement. This perception of others as objects solely there for him to use and abuse is also why Vickers was able to throw John under the bus in court and claim he'd murdered his own son, and also portray Karen as a whore, and also state that she didn't care about Jamie. It was also his last hurrah, his last opportunity to manipulate and control the situation, trying to turn the jury and the local community against Karen and John. I'm sure he loved every minute of his time on the stand. I have little doubt that Darren Vickers would have carried on molesting and likely killing children had he not been stopped. And heartbreakingly, there are indicators that he potentially was already doing the former before he was eventually caught, and this had a tragic outcome. Specifically, during the police investigation, it became clear that as well as grooming Jamie's parents, he was also grooming one of his brothers, John Jr., who was 11 years old at the time. Vickers seemed to show a particular interest in John Jr. and bought him a new bike and new shoes, things a child would find appealing. He told police that a few days after Vickers moved into the family home, he took him out to some woods, gave him a cigarette, and told him that's where Jamie was, but if he said a word to anyone, he would find himself in the same place, and no one would ever see him, just like his brother. The eldest sister in the family also told police that she was really worried about the amount of attention that Vickers was showing her brother. There's been speculation that Vickers molested John Jr. and then swore him to secrecy. Unfortunately, I think this cannot be discounted, and even if this didn't happen, it's clear that he was his next intended victim. John Jr., potentially due to his own abuse and losing his brother, developed a drug addiction and took his own life at age 30 in 2017. But Darren Vickers doesn't care about any of this. He has no remorse for his actions, no conscience, no regrets about destroying the Lavis family. He's a monster, and he should die behind prison walls. If he comes out, he will manipulate, control, abuse and destroy others. That is all he knows how to do. That's all he wants to do. So, what are your thoughts on this case? If you like the content, then consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button. You can also send a one-off donation to support the channel using the thanks button. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.